Hi. So first of all, I acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which Macquarie University stands, the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since time immemorial. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So just a little gentle warning that this talk will include stories that might potentially be harmful or triggering, so please take care when listening. Just the next, oh, there we go, perfect, thank you. So the findings that I'll present in this talk are from an empirical study that I conducted for my PhD in philosophy. The area of philosophy that my thesis focused on was epistemic injustice. So broadly speaking, epistemic injustice considers how institutions and epistemic practices are structured in ways that are unjust. It is largely known from Miranda Fricker's 2007 conceptualization of it as wrongs done to someone in their capacity as a knower. So this includes both testimonial injustice, which is when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word due to negative identity prejudicial stereotypes, and hermeneutical injustice, which is when someone has a significant area of their social experience obscured from understanding, owing to prejudicial flaws in shared resources for social interpretation. That sounded like a lot of gibberish, but hopefully something made sense. So epistemic injustice has now been applied to different domains such as healthcare and psychology, and has been a framework to discern wrongs that harm people on specific axes of oppression. So for example, I investigate forms of epistemic injustice that LGBTQIA+ people face with interpersonal interactions. So I conducted semi-structured interviews with 18 participants who are a part of the LGBTQIA+ community, allies and parents of transgender children. I asked participants to share stories of either themselves or others changing their minds and becoming more accepting of LGBTQIA+ lives and experiences. So a large part of this study was to investigate whether the theoretical philosophical concepts that I discuss in my thesis were relevant to real life experiences of people becoming more accepting of LGBTQIA+ lives and experiences. So basically testing out these philosophical concepts in the real world. So recruitment for these interviews was conducted via flyers on community notice boards, social media, and word of mouth. Because of the sensitive nature of the study, I ensured that I only recruited participants who came to me first, and they were provided with all the details of the study in an information and consent form. So the majority of my participants ended up being from word of mouth, as members of the community would pass on information about the study to their friends once they had deemed it safe. Interviews were conducted in person and on Zoom, and I loosely followed an interview prompt guide, but I mainly followed the lead of the participant and their stories. My initial coding was guided by the central research questions, identifying which aspects of it each participant addressed. I then coded inductively to identify patterns and recurring themes across the interviews. My philosophical suggestions for providing epistemic justice for the LGBTQIA+ community were then shaped in the later chapters of the thesis by the findings from the study, which I then used to offer recommendations for different groups. So how members of the community can deal with people in the process of changing their minds, how allies can better take on the burden of educating others about the LGBTQIA+ community, and how the media could better represent the community. So just to move on to changes of mind. So there were many findings that came out of the study, some surprising and some unsurprising. A sort of surprising finding was that changes of mind were not often light bulb moments. An interesting thing to say about light bulb moments here is that it depends whether or not you are the one changing your mind or you're witnessing someone else change their mind. So in some cases, what looked like a sudden change of mind on the part of a parent, for example, could actually have been many years of coming to terms with their child's identity. So there were some instances of light bulb moments of changes of mind. So for example, P11, a mother of a trans boy described her child getting their period for the first time, and she saw the distress on his face. It was like the blinkers came off for me, and it really was. From that moment, it was just like, yeah, I get it now. P8, an ally, described a singular moment of realization that it didn't make sense for her to believe the negative views of the LGBTQIA plus community that she had been taught. She says, I kind of just realized it wasn't that scary or that bad. And then I kind of thought to myself, why am I against this? This was quite a profound change of mind for P8, who went from using words like hate for referring to how she used to feel about the community to becoming an active ally for people in her life and her friendship circles. But it was more common for participants to describe gradual changes of mind. So yeah, the gradual change of mind was a prominent theme that emerged in the data, with many different examples indicating that people often change their minds over a long period of time. Some changes of mind were intentional, so via people doing their own research to educate themselves on LGBTQIA plus topics once someone had come out to them, or via psychological processing, such as people needing to process the information of someone coming out to them by understanding how it relates to them. So for example, P15 and her husband educated themselves when their child came out as trans. And this process of informing themselves encouraged a change of mind, mainly on the part of P15's husband, who was not as far along in the process as P15 was. So after her and her husband chatted to their daughter's gender experience psychologist with their daughter's permission, her husband went off and did his own research. So once he started thinking about it and looking around, it didn't seem so unusual. An example of psychological processing was when P10 came out to their sister as a lesbian. P10 explained that the only reason that their sister sort of got her head around it was her reflecting on herself. P10's sister asked herself, okay, how do I feel? Have I always been attracted to men? A similar process occurred when P10 later on came out to their sister as non-binary, and their sister asked herself, what makes me feel like a woman? Do I feel confident in being a woman? Do I feel secure in that? She then figured out that things that make her feel like a woman might be the things that her sibling doesn't feel, which then allowed her to understand the differences between them. So in another example, psychological processing was part of a sequence via which the participant came to the conclusion that was accepting. So P15 explained that when her child came out as a trans girl, she tried to understand what it actually means to be female. She explained that stereotypical feminine traits don't really resonate with her, and so trying to work out what it actually meant to be female was quite confusing. She eventually came to the conclusion that she doesn't actually have to understand why she's going to do it, and that all she needs to do is respect the person in front of me. So during the process of attempting to understand her daughter, she changed her mind about the need to understand why. So in contrast with intentional gradual changes of mind, some gradual changes of mind were more passive. Participants shifted their stance slowly in the face of various factors, such as persistent argument or advocacy by a close family member, or in keeping with gradual changes in social norms, such as the shift in public sentiment regarding marriage equality. One example of this was a story by P4, a trans woman. She explained how over the course of many years, her parents slowly became more accepting and supportive. She first came out as trans and first asked to take steps to go on hormone treatment when she was 12 years old. At this time, her request was met with resistance by her parents. When she came out, her mother did research on Google that took her to a Christian help website that gave advice like, be sure to hide all feminine clothes away from the individual, don't let them buy their own, etc. So this led her mother to hide her own clothes away from her child. Over time, and largely as a result of persistence by P4, her mother's attitude shifted towards becoming more accepting of gay people first, incorrectly implying that her child was gay by calling her child her rainbow. This was on Facebook, I believe. Later, P4's mother's attitude shifted further as she became more accepting of trans people, but even then, for a long time, was unwilling to go that step further and accept that her own child was trans. P4 attributes her mother's eventual agreement for her to go to a counsellor to get the referral that would be the first step in the process for hormone treatment and affirmation of her trans identity to her persistent pressure. She says, I think it was just my stubbornness of keep like bashing in the wall, and then eventually it worked, but I just kept asking. She stated that she thinks it was a case of gradual change. Another example of a gradual change of mind as a result of persistent argument from an external party emerged in the discussion with P1, who was an ally, who explained that his dad was previously not very accepting of LGBTQIA+ lives and experiences. However, P1 and his dad continued to have discussions about it and kept talking about it. These continual discussions are what P1 took to be part of the reason that his dad became more accepting and understanding of the community. It was at least P1's persistence that sort of managed to get through to him. So now we move on to kind of the messy period in the process of changing minds. So my data's indicated that there is a messy period in this process where actions don't seem to match up with beliefs. So these inconsistencies were partly about insincerity, but they also reflect the phenomenon of gradual change where actions and claims may not be consistent. Some participants described family and friends who appeared to have changed their mind, but later acted in inconsistent ways. For example, P10 explains coming out to their grandparents as a lesbian, to which they responded with, as long as you're happy, but they have since made it clear that they think it's a phase and that they don't know what they want because they're so young. When P10 later came out to their grandparents as non-binary, their grandparents responded with sentiments like, this makes total sense and this is not my language, so I'm going to reorient my language and really try. However, P10 explains that every time they have FaceTime since then, they will say things like, our beautiful granddaughter, you'll always be our little girl, and buy birthday cards that say, to our beautiful granddaughter. P16, an asexual and transgender participant, described another example of inconsistent statements of support. P16 made it clear to their mother that they didn't want to date anyone after many instances of questioning from their mother. Their mother seemed to let the matter drop and realized that it wasn't worth asking the question as often. P16 believes that at some level their mother wants to see them have a family, but seems to understand that it's not worth wasting what time they have together to keep bringing it up as they live in different countries. This seems to be a case of a change in action as opposed to a change in belief. P16 makes this clear by saying, I think there's how people behave on the surface versus what they really feel deep inside. Maybe deep down she's still upset about it on some level, but at least if she knows not to bring it up, then that suits me. P16's analysis is further underpinned on the occasions that it still does emerge as their mother continues to say things like, people who don't settle down and have a family by the time they're 30, they might kind of not get to do so for a long time. In the context of the relationship with P16's mother, P16 was happy with their mother simply not mentioning relationships or children. Of course, P16's mother might yet become a more pronounced ally, and it would be consistent with my findings about the messy and gradual process of changing minds if it were the case that she's at the beginning of her journey to becoming some sort of ally. P11, a mother of a trans child, explains that when she first told her mother about her child coming out as trans, the grandmother responded with, my old name of child will always be my granddaughter. Over time, she now uses the correct name. However, she has not gotten used to using they, them pronouns and only uses he, him, even though her grandchild is non-binary. This is slightly inconsistent and might reflect the messiness of someone who is still coming to accept or learn about these differences. Or it may also reflect the age of the grandparent and the potentially increased challenges of changing one's way of expression after a lifetime of entrenchment. P5 provided another example of the messiness of someone in the midst of a gradual change of mind. She mentioned that her boyfriend was bisexual and went through a process, and she went through a process where she went up and down accepting his identity, from challenging it, completely refuting it, to now being in a more healthy space where I think he feels that his identity is valid. P5 mentioned that she would challenge him and question it, and that her and her boyfriend would have long discussions with their friends about his sexuality. P5's messy back and forth change of mind took its toll on her boyfriend. She stated that these public discussions with their friends started to get to him, and he would bring it up months later, saying things like, "That was really embarrassing when everyone was saying that I'm not bisexual." So in the abstract for this talk, I mentioned that my finding that changing minds is often a gradual period in which it is sometimes not entirely clear whether or not someone is in the process of a mind change, is an encouraging and reassuring finding concerning temporality. Just because the change of mind doesn't happen right away doesn't mean that it's not in the process. However, this is not to ignore that the time involved can be really significant for members of the community. P4's mother eventually became accepting, but P4 lost years in seeking medical care, and expressed just how despondent they were throughout high school. And P5's boyfriend was harmed by his girlfriend and friends questioning his sexuality. So the gradual messy period of mind changes might be a confusing and harmful period of time for an individual who is a part of the LGBTQIA+ community, when having to communicate with those with whom they have a close relationship, for example, family or friends. It seems natural for an individual to want to know for certain that their family member accepts them for who they are. In the final chapter of my thesis, I came up with some recommendations for the LGBTQIA+ community when dealing with the process of someone changing their mind. Some of these recommendations were based on what participants kind of mentioned to me, particularly P16. So for example, look for changes in action. Is there any evidence of a commitment to becoming supportive? Is there some way to communicate with your family member or friend that is not fraught with tension? Obviously, that puts the burden on the person within the LGBTQIA+ community to take on the responsibility of trying to communicate with someone who should be doing their own work to communicate well with them. But in the cases where people might want to do this work, trying to figure out better ways to talk with people might be something for the future to think about here for research. And most importantly, another recommendation was self-monitor yourself for early detection of mental health warning signs when engaging with family members or friends who are not supportive. What are your limits or vulnerabilities? Although P16 and P4, so the asexual and transgender participant whose mother stopped asking when they were going to be in a relationship or have a family, and the trans participant whose mother slowly changed her mind after years of conversations, do ultimately have somewhat effective conversations with their mothers. They may not be successful in terms of minimizing emotional impact. Like I said before, it would be interesting to do future research to explore what a promising or successful template that might support a productive conversation might look like. So finally, bearing in mind that the process of someone changing their mind is messy and gradual, which can certainly be a harmful period, one reassuring and maybe encouraging finding is that just because the change of mind doesn't happen right away, doesn't mean that it's not in the process. So people often say things like they'll never change their mind or they're stuck in their own ways. The findings from my study indicate that it is very possible that people can change their minds and become more accepting, and that it can happen in many different ways and on many different timelines. But it's of the utmost importance that we look after ourselves in the meantime. So that's it, but I would, love to hear any feedback that you have on any of these recommendations or findings. It would be super helpful, and open to lots of critique as well. Thank you.